Professor Wilson, it's an honor for us to talk to you. I was walking through the corridor and saw all those fossils or animals, and suddenly I thought, of course we go to the nature, we go to the countryside, but it seems somehow boring. I don't know if it's really less diverse or is we've lost the capacity to see.
Nature, it is said, is beautiful. Nature is sometimes inspirational. Nature provides solace and relaxation and peace of mind. But nature can be boring because of one thing. People do not know how to look at nature. They see the trees and they are distracted by a bird, and they see some butterflies and a flower, but they do not realize the magnitude of life that exists there. The difference between the average person enjoying nature in the conventional way and that of the trained observer, the biologist, the poet, the student of the environment, how it's constructed and how it relates to human beings psychologically, is that they see much more of the content of nature. And whether it's just a meter on the ground of a forest, whether it's an entire forest, whether it's the whole planet, or whether it's coming back down even to the enormous variety of bacteria we have in our mouth and all the way through our intestine. We are a walking garden of microorganisms in which we live with complete symbiosis. That is, we are dependent upon it as it's dependent on us.
You've been studying biodiversity for all of your life. And this gives you a unique perspective. It seems that we are more aware now about the importance of biodiversity, about preserving biodiversity. But are we better off or worse than when you started studying?
Biology itself began with the study of biodiversity. Those are the studies initiated by Carl Linnaeus in Sweden, beginning in 1735. We have been paying attention to the variety of life in all forms, more and more, going down into the microscopic, going to every part of the world. And during that period of time, the number of species we know has been declining steadily. Species of plants and animals have been declining at the rate of 100 to 1,000 times faster than before the coming of humanity. That's how rapidly we are wiping out the biodiversity of the world. So much so that if we continue the same rate at which we are extinguishing species, then by the end of this century, we will be down by as much as 1/2 the number that were here before we came along as a species.
Wow. And what should we do? So in your book, The Future of Life, you created like a plan to preserve nature.
That's right.
And biodiversity. What's this plan?
I think that what's required is a worldwide effort to save the rest of life, the biodiversity, and all of the species possible, which would be comparable to the climate change initiative agreed to by all the countries at the Paris Accord. In other words, we need to have as vivid an understanding of biological diversity and how fast it's disappearing and what that will mean to us as a species, because we are damaged by that loss ourselves.
Yeah.
With an understanding of what it is, how fast it's disappearing, and what measures can be taken to stop it, to bring it back close to what it was before humans came. And we need an international agreement comparable to the Paris Accord in order to save the rest of life.
But average people might agree about the importance of keeping biodiversity, but they have this vision of, in case of doubt, human first. And I think you challenge this vision, no?
Well, because it's wrong. That is to say, as biodiversity disappears, allowing it to disappear is humans second. In other words, it's rather comparable to climate change. When you get fewer and fewer species, then the whole system can begin to unravel. It'll be weakened the more you remove species. But at a certain point, you start unraveling the ecosystem. And what happens is that certain species no longer have partners, that is, species that they depend upon, like a butterfly on a particular kind of plant. The plant disappears, the butterfly disappears. And if the butterfly disappears, then the species that have been feeding on the butterfly or depend on, among the plants, that kind of butterfly to pollinate it, they disappear. And as they disappear, other species disappear. And it starts just unraveling. And in addition, it happens when an ecosystem, a natural ecosystem disappears, that opens now whole regions of the physical environment to alien species. That is, species that are not native to the system, and they grow in numbers and become major pests. They include agricultural pests. They include the carriers of disease. They include the capacity to crowd out native species. So they block waterways or take up agricultural land and have to be controlled. More and more of these alien species, we call them the enemy species or the invasive species. In the United States, the more you weaken the natural ecosystem, the more you extinguish species. In the United States, over the invasive species, the ones that have come in because we have been eliminating natural species, cost the United States each year over $200 billion.
Wow.
That's just economic, not counting health, destruction of the beauty of the environment, and so on. So it's very much to our interest if we pay as much attention to the living environment as we have to the climate.
Then, for the health of the ecosystems, there will be species that are more important than others. And sometimes are not the ones that we have in mind, some start species that we all want to preserve. And there are others that are more important for the ecosystem, no?
There are what we call keynote species. That means if you pluck them out, you allow them to go extinct, suddenly, to your astonishment, most or the whole ecosystem collapses. We don't know what those keystone species are. We don't know them because they might even be one still unknown to science. And if we know it well, we still don't know enough about its biology and the ecosystem, all the other species around it, to predict whether it's going to be a keystone species or not. Or the keystone species might be a kind of organism which exists in another part of the world, and when introduced into our natural ecosystems by our means, by accident, often or our own purpose, can destroy it all.
Yeah.
At any rate, the point is we have to be careful with which species we allow to go extinct.
Yeah.
And we have to learn a great deal more about what the species are in the first place. And we need vastly more knowledge about how ecosystems are put together by these species to create nature that we so love, but also to save our own comfort and life, because nature,
We depend
of course, nature cleanses our water for us. It provides the soil through immense numbers of small creatures and microbes living in the soil. It provides an enrichment of the soil that makes our agriculture possible. It provides the very air we breathe. If we start letting more and more species disappear, if we lose, say, half the species by the end of this century, then we're going to have to be like space engineers, with the Earth a gigantic, true spaceship, in which we no longer have enough nature to do some of the functions we take for granted. We will have to start taking care of purifying the air, of creating soil in which we can grow crops. We will have to do it ourselves.
And what would be the biggest threat? Because you mentioned climate change, but sometimes it seems that climate change is getting so important that it masks other environmental problems like contamination or invasive species or deforestation. Maybe we're putting not too much because we would need more attention to climate change. But is this phenomena that we are forgetting about other issues or not?
Now the world is green. That is, everybody understands the environment is important. But what they're thinking about, most 99% of people, they're thinking mostly about climate, about pollution of water, and the things that most obviously affect us on a day-to-day basis. They are not thinking very much at all about the living part of the environment. There ought to be a return to balance between our science and technology to save or prevent the physical change of planet Earth, to bring up the study and preservation of the living part, comparable to that. And that's the crusade I'm on. Let us realize that of the approximately 2 million species we have identified, and know some of which we know a little bit, where there are an estimated 10 million. We only know 20% of what the species are.
That's incredible.
To correct that, explore the living environment, understand ecosystems, and then save the living part of the environment should be as important in the long term as preventing the climate change from killing everything.
Yeah. You did a proposal once called Half Earth, saying that we should preserve very large amounts of ecosystems. Do you think governments should do that, or
Yes, they will. With all of our conservation efforts in all the organizations around the world trying to save nature, we have stopped the downward slide from beginning to get weak and being vulnerable all the way down to going extinct. We have stopped the slide down of only 1/5, 20%, of those species that are considered vulnerable and on their way down to extinction. So this brought me, because I've devoted so many years to both the theory and the practice of conservation of species, to suggest that we need to do this in one big step, if we can, because it's not working.
Yeah.
We're just slowing extinction a little bit. Many years ago, I and a few biologists doing the mathematical modeling and measurements of species extinction and numbers of species as a function of the size of the area they were allowed to live in, the reserves, found that the size of the reserve has a pretty exact relation to what percentage of the species you start with survive and are still there. And it turns out that if you look at those figures and what data have been acquired over the many years since I started writing on it, that if we could save half the Earth's surface, half the land and half the sea, we would save, that is, bring back to normal status and low rates of extinction, 85% or mid-80s, somewhere in there, of the species. Meaning we can save most of the species and do it quickly if we could set aside half of the Earth, half the sea, and half the land as a reserve. Now, right away, I think the response to that is likely by most people to say, but that's absurd. We have 7.3 billion people in the world today. They are not going to allow us to set aside 1/2 for the rest of life, as reserve. That's a wrong assumption.
Wow, that's
we can manage it. Yes. I outlined this a bit in my book, Half Earth. We just start looking. When you start looking, you find that, yes, these areas exist. They can be made reserves. You don't have to put people out. In fact, it'll be a big help to many indigenous people who depend upon the natural environment. You do not have to intrude upon private property rights. But there are areas that you can go to and then make it work, I believe, with the help of governments. And that's what I've done a preliminary map of. And when you start mapping the Earth and looking at what's available in space, then you see that there's a lot of space left where nature still exists.
Yeah, but seeing these examples, besides data showing that we are not doing very well in keeping the preservation, are you optimistic?
Of course I am, because there isn't any other way that you should be, and because we have to solve this problem. I was like it was very much like the climate change. We realize that there isn't any choice. We can't argue about whether it needs to be done. It's just how are we going to do it? And I think we have succeeded in doing it on the sign and off camera, providing Mr. Trump.
Yes.
Someone holds it.
Well,
at any rate, never mind.
That's a big challenge also for
me. I mean, there's always risk, but we will change that back if he steps in. At any rate, we must do it. And here, let me give you another example to show why optimism is very high and why Half Earth has the support of the professional conservationists generally. First of all, it's not a process. It's not we'll do this with the elephants and we'll do that with West Africa and we will persuade the Ecuadorian government to save Yosemite. All those things are extremely valuable, but as we've seen, they're moving at too slow an overall pace. So that's a process. Half Earth is a goal. Half Earth says and shows that if we take the one step of setting aside half the Earth and the sea, then we'll save just about a substantial amount, probably get well over 85 or even 90%. We'll do the job in one step. Okay, now let me give you an example of why this seems more likely. Than not, of actually working. At the present time, we have about 15%, roughly, of the land under preservation. That's actually a pretty good start. We just want to go to get 35% more.
Yeah.
Okay, now in the sea, we're down at the 3 to 5% level, outside or including the economic exclusion zones, that's the territorial waters of the 150 nations that have coastline. And about overall, the oceans of the world are about somewhere between 3 and 5% saved. So how on earth are we going to go to 50%?
Yeah.
Easy. Easy.
Easy.
Well, if you will follow the results of 2 studies that have been made, one of them by the United Nations and another one, very careful expert analyses, which have the following result. If we were to take the open sea, away from the territory, the part not in territorial waters, but the open ocean, that's the commons of all the nations, and bring those off limit to fishing. All right? Now we're at 50% of the marine environment. But how on earth are you going to persuade people to stop fishing in the open ocean? It's almost providential, because the studies have shown that if we declare, all the countries in the world declare the open seas off limits, and we might be able to do this in the same way as the climate change agreement, then the productivity worldwide of the territorial waters will increase. They'll increase because when you save the open ocean, you're saving the major routes and growing areas of a very large amount of the fisheries of the world, along with a lot of marine diversity of other organisms. And you save so much of it that it flows out of the open ocean into the shallower waters of the territorial seas. That the overall amount will be an increase, a substantial increase of productivity in the territorial waters. So there has to be an argument of self-interest for each country in turn among the maritime countries. But we I think, have been handed a very fortunate circumstance that makes 50% of the marine areas of the world a possibility. So this is something that has to be done. Mm-hmm. It just has to be done.
It just has to be done.
So let's do it, and it's probably going to be easier than most people think, and that it's going to also be a very pleasant thing to do for people everywhere in the world, to know that it's safe. Mm-hmm. Half of the planet is safe for nature. It's safe for them, for their families, for their descendants, and the earth as a whole will maintain itself, even though we continue to be pretty destructive in our half.
In our land. Professor Wilson, I don't want to finish this conversation without talking about social insects, and specifically about ants.
Yeah.
You have ants everywhere in this room, even the light.
This is Ant Central.
Yeah, you are the leading expert in ants. Are you still studying them? Are you still passionate about ants?
Yes, it is. I'm rather elderly. I'm 88, but I just returned from a field trip in the Deep South to the Mobile and Kennesaw Rivers Delta, which has something like a rainforest in floodplain area in this delta where the great Alabama River comes down. And in that very dense jungle-like or rainforest-like environment, I was doing research on ants down there just last week. So I still am doing studies, which I hope I'll be publishing as scientific results in a year or two.
This is very inspirational for many people.
I'm happy to hear that they like ants that much. But the point is that, yes, the number of people around the world working on ants. Spain has a lot of younger scholars, real experts on ants now. It's going up like this. But that's the way it should be, because ants are the dominant insects in the world the insects of about that size. And they're very important in most ecosystems on the land. So it's a good thing to study. But earlier in my career, I studied on the chemical communication. Animals communicate by smell and taste. You know, they're pheromones.
No, I remember reading one of your books when you see the ants.
Yeah.
There are some chemicals, when they die, they segregate some chemicals. If you put this chemical in a live ant, the rest take them to the grave.
Yes, we know that there are somewhere between 10 and 20 kinds of chemicals they use to signal one another, and in combinations they have something like a sentence. They can actually qualify what one pheromone means by adding another, and they can give different messages according to how much they put. You know, it's sort of like our emphasis on our words. We say something like, listen to what I tell you. Listen to what I tell you. Listen to what I tell you. Just the way we do that, the ants have combinations and they have degrees, amount of pheromone they allow out, which says the equivalent of things like that. It can be alarm, alarm, attention, attention. The worker ant is run back into the nest. I have food, I have food, I have discovered food. And it runs among the ants, and the other ants touch it with their antennae, and they say, yes, yes, yes. It tastes like a dead insect. And pretty soon the ant goes out and says, follow me, follow me. And it's released pheromones from one part of the body. Now it's pushing down the bottom of its body and is laying an odor trail. It says, follow me, and they come out, you know. And they know they're coming out to see a dead insect that they can bring in.
Yes. Studying social insects, you created this so powerful concept of sociobiology. You were the creator of sociobiology. It was controversial for many people. With all these decades, I don't know if it was misunderstood for some people or misinterpreted. How have you seen the evolution of the field of sociobiology?
Yeah, sociobiology, after being under heavy fire criticism in the 1970s, I introduced it with the book Sociobiology. But in the 1970s, it had a big impact in biology, but unfortunately for how it was taken, the majority of, in fact almost all social scientists, including anthropologists, sociologists, and so on, thought that the human mind has no instincts. Everything is, you know, all of our mind is built from a learning and from the culture that directs what is learned. And that was dogma at that time. And what I said in sociobiology is perhaps we have instincts, perhaps we have evolved them just like animals have evolved them, and perhaps they explain a lot of our strange behavior, like having wars and being racist and so on. But there were many, particularly on the left. The left was very strong in the 1970s, you see, particularly because of the Vietnam War and our belief that we probably do have an instinct, you know, for tribes and going to war. So this was rigorously opposed. However, over the years, with the development of neuroscience, brain science, psychology and the development, you know, study of the development and of genetic influence, exact science, sociobiology, the basic argument for humans was proved to be true.
Thank you very much for this conversation, Professor Wilson. It's been touching and inspiring at the same time.
It is a privilege and a deep pleasure to speak to an audience, including my many friends in Spain.